Ladies and gentlemen, I salute you. Thank you for the opportunity for me to make this presentation to you on this day. My name is Sultan Jeremani. I would like to go straight into my presentation titled The Political Ethics of Enslavement and Subjugation. I start off by sharing the overview. In the overview, I'll discuss the historical context to my presentation, the Portuguese and their influence on the East African coast, the enablers of the slave trade that happened during that period, the social aftermath of the subjugation and slave trade that took place, the socio-economic aftermath of the same, the political aftermath of the slave trade and subjugation that took place. I will also talk about briefly the Heligoland Zanzibar swap as it presents the context in which all of these activities took place. I will also talk to you about the German East Africa Company and how its activities led to subjugation on the East African coast. I will talk to you about the administrative and judicial legacy brought about by the slave trade and the subjugation on the East African coast. Last but not least, I'll also touch on the palace intrigues in the Sultan of Zanzibar's palace and how its activities also influenced some of the key happenings on the East African coast. The earliest reference we have to the slave trade comes from the Zenj rebellion of 869 to 833 AD. The Abbasid Caliphate, at its peak, traversed a huge area of the present-day Middle East. And you can see that I show that in my presentation. All the area that is colored in, could I call this cyan, is what represents the Abbasid Caliphate. The other colors, as you will see in the presentation, represent the influence with which the Abbasid Caliphate had over a great portion of the Arabian Peninsula, stretching all the way to Spain and great parts of North Africa. The 10th century geographer Al-Masudi talks about the Zenj. Ibn Battuta, the well-known Moroccan scholar and explorer, reported the existence of enslaved people in Kilwa in 1331. And I will show you on the map where Kilwa is shortly, but it is within the East African coast. Ibn Battuta spent a day in Mombasa, and shortly I will also be sharing with you another map showing the location of Mombasa for you to be able to put into context the discussions going forward. But back in 869 AD, Ali, who led the Zenj rebellion, promised the enslaved Bantu tribes that freedom was just within the corner and wealth will be in abundance if they give him support. The Zenj rose up and slew their masters. Word went round in the empire, and more enslaved people rose up, leading to the fall of the city of Basra. This happened in 871. Retaliatory attacks failed to quell the uprising until 879, when the Abbasid Caliph sent his son, who pushed the rebels out of Basra and to the south. By 883, the rebellion had been quashed with the death and capture of Ali and his commanders. And the German scholar Theodor Noldecker observed that the empire never really recovered from the rebellion due to the social instability that followed, including the fracture into anonymous dynasties between 861 and 945 AD. In 1497, Vasco da Gama was dispatched with 4 ships in his famous voyage. Vasco da Gama, after touching at Mozambique, anchored off Mombasa on April 7, 1498. He found it to be a prosperous and wealthy town. In 1585, a Turkish corsair called Ali Bey entered Mombasa. He did attack the existing Portuguese and drove them off. Between 1586 and 1589, the Zimbas overran Kilwa to Malindi. So Kilwa, if you look at the map, will be in between Mozambique and Mombasa. In March 1589, the Portuguese returned with 20 ships and went into something we call the showdown in the City of War. There was a period of calm between 1592 and 1612 until the Sultan of Mombasa at the time quarreled with the Portuguese governor, and it led to the Sultan fleeing from the city. Eventually he was killed in Rabai by the various locals that were in that region, probably as hangovers or arising from disputes and dislike of the Sultan, because the Rabai were a local community and they might have suffered under the Sultan's rule. It happens that the Sultan had a son. The son was sent for studies. He even married a Portuguese wife and returned back to Mombasa under the name Geronimo. He even became the Sultan. Through treachery, he was able to kick out the Portuguese at that time and had to flee the city when he was informed that there was backup coming. He lived the rest of his life as a buccaneer. The picture on the top right shows the current state of the Fort Jesus, where the Portuguese made their base. The lower pictures show my father loading up the cannonballs in his years later as a tourist to that area. I use these pictures to illustrate the existing memory or the remnants of the heritage of the Portuguese at the time, and ask the question, what else did the Portuguese leave with us? Between 1639 and 1698, 20 Portuguese governors ruled Mombasa. Between 1698 or in 1698 itself, the Omani Arabs ousted the Portuguese. In 1749, the Al-Busaidi family replaces the Urabi as the ruling family in Muscat. And this is important because activities in Muscat of the ruling family had an effect on the local population as well. In 1785, Imam Ahmad bin Said visits Mombasa and compels the Mazruis to recognize him as their sovereign. In 1840, Sayyid Said, the ruling Sultan at the time, settled in Mombasa and established a dual seat in Oman and in Zanzibar. Between 1698 and 1895, Mombasa was under the rule of the Mazruis as the Walis. Walis are also known as governors. In 1895, Mazrui rebellion against the Sultan of Zanzibar occurred. For various reasons, the Mazruis were not comfortable reporting to an Al-Busaidi who ruled from Zanzibar, the enablers. In chattel slavery, there was both the element of export of enslaved people and plantation slavery for the growth of cloves. The abolition of the Atlantic slave trade made the British and the French move their activities from the Atlantic region to the Indian Ocean in places like Madagascar, Reunion, and Zanzibar. Social hierarchy was another enabler. The hierarchy existed such that the European was first among equals, followed by the Arabs, and the Africans took the last position. Riches from the sugar plantations and the ivory trade contributed as enablers towards enslavement of the people of East Africa and the trade that existed at the time. Money changing and lending was also a key component of the enablers that prevailed or existed in the East African coast at the time. Tribal wars and territorial domination between ethnic tribes within East Africa and the territorial domination activities of the various European powers at the time contributed as enablers of the slave trade that took place on the East African coast between 1500 and 1900. When you look at the map on the screen, it shows the directions and numbers of enslaved people from the various locations and the general direction in which they were taken to. The social aftermath. It is estimated that 15,148,681 enslaved people were exported in the 4 slave trades in Africa that took place between 1400 and 1900. 1.5 million people were enslaved and exported from East Africa in the 19th century. Arab merchants disrupted the land tenure system within East Africa by imposing their new ideals and looking to enrich themselves by expanding territory. The availability of enslaved females also caused a devaluation of the bride price for free women, a phenomenon that took place within the East African coast. Religion also emerged as a vital element of sovereignty. Many of the people who were enslaved adopted Islam, and many of the individuals who did not adopt Islam were branded as pagans and were open for for enslavement and slave trade. When you look at the map, it shows you the general location of the various tribes that lived within the East Africa, that live today even still within the East African coast. The socio-economic aftermath. A court ruled against a presidential consent and determined that anyone willing to buy beach plots along the Kenyan coast could now do so without presidential consent or approval of the provincial administration. Of course, this was borrowed from the colonial and from the Sultanate period, where the Sultan or the governors were at liberty to give or dish out land. In 1989, Parliament enacted the Mazrui Trust Repeal Act. It happened that in the previous years, the Mazruis had established what we call a trust to secure their interests. And this was done during the period of the Sultanate. As years went by, it was greatly challenged. And in 2012, Mazruis went to court and won the appeal. Critics argued that the act discriminated against the Mijikenda, and it did not factor the Mijikenda's interests when the act was being drafted. Another piece of evidence of the socio-economic aftermath is the numerous land registration systems that have been enacted in Kenya since it was a protectorate and long before that. Some of the political aftermath items that I can highlight from this period include the first Lancaster House Conference on the independence of Kenya, which revisited the 10-mile coastal strip. On the right of the screen, you will see a picture of the first Prime Minister of Kenya and the first President of Kenya, seated with some of members who became members of his cabinet during that time. In 17 September 1961, Ronald Ngala lowered the flag of the Sultan of Zanzibar in Malindi an act that many called treason because the Sultan at that time was still a recognized figure within the coastal strip. Ronald Ngala was a leader of the African population within the East African coast, and he had championed the rights from the perspective of usurpers coming in and kicking out the indigenous Africans, relegating them to enslaved people. Land became a talking point by many of the political parties. The president inherited the powers held by colonial governors and the Sultan, and some of it has been abused over time. I refer to Heligoland and the Zanzibar swap as an example of the agitation that took place between European powers with effects on the local population and with effects on the East African coast. The Heligoland island, which is represented by a small red balloon on the map on the top corner, was acquired by Britain after the Napoleonic Wars between 1803 and 1815. Ernest William Beckett, the MP for Whitby, outlined the 30-year history with Zanzibar. He decried Germans' influence in Zanzibar and the many atrocities that were committed during that time. The German East Africa Company was founded by a 28-year-old Karl Peters, who was agitating for a colony to be established under the German Reich in Africa. He did this through treaties and treachery. The German East Africa Company was inspired by the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company has the reputation to date of being the largest ever incorporated company, and a public company for that matter. The German East Africa Company adopted the personality of its founder, who was temperamental and used extrajudicial undertakings to achieve his goals. This led to the Abushiri Revolt of 1888 to 1891 against the German-held trading posts and towns. Karl Peters was eventually convicted in the Potsdam Disciplinary Chamber for Colonial Officials, though no criminal proceedings were preferred against him. Palace intrigues were a key component of the happenings within the period in question. For example, Said Hamad, at 41 years old, had ruled for 3 years before he passed away, and the allegations were that his cousin, Said Khalid, who wanted to rule without being referred to as a British puppet, had poisoned his cousin so that he may come in and take over in his stead. He invited what is now known as the shortest war in history, the Anglo-Zanzibar War, which lasted 38 to 45 minutes, effectively making the 6th Sultan a ruler for only 3 days. I conclude my presentation with a tweet from Professor Makau Mutua, who is the distinguished professor at the State University of New York and also a former dean of the University of Buffalo School of Law. He tweeted that there is no such thing as judicialization of politics, but there is such a thing as the politicization of the judiciary. My presentation is about the interconnectedness of the political, of the social, and of the economic. It is difficult to assess subjugation and enslavement from one prism without factoring other components to it. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you. Meanwhile, I invite you to connect with me via Twitter, via LinkedIn, and on my ResearchGate profile so that you can continue this discussion offline. Thank you.